Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our series with Caleb Monroe. I know you will be encouraged by his insights as we continue to discuss the relationship between the artist and the church. This is Karen Covell for Hollywood Changemakers. Well, and I'd like to now take a left turn with the teaching to say, is there another aspect we can handle? And that is, what if there's also spiritual battle involved, where the enemy understands the power of Hollywood, the power of storytelling, the power of art and entertainment, and doesn't want Christians there, because then we can tell stories with God's heart in them. We can preach the gospel through storytelling. There's a powerful influence that Christians have by being in arts and entertainment. And I feel like there's sometimes a real battle to allow Christians to tell great stories, not Christian stories, but great stories with heart and truth and hope and joy and all the things that God offers. And that's a battle that we face. And a lot of Christians allow the lies of the enemy to say, stay away, it's a dangerous place, you'll lose your faith, you shouldn't be there. And so Christians are told to stay away, when I think vital, active Christians who are creative should say, no, this is exactly where we should be, and encourage other people to come with us so that we can actually make an eternal difference through just great stories.
Yes, I think that's true. I agree with your thesis statement. But I also think that there's a dynamic that goes on even before or under that, which is not just a desire to prevent Christians from telling great stories, but a desire to prevent anyone from telling great stories. So 2 things, a biblical example and then some modern neuroscience. The biblical example is that God himself designed these 2 great works of art, the tabernacle and the temple, which together were sort of his home for his people for centuries. And he chose Bezalel and Oholiab, which were God followers, to build the tabernacle. But the temple, he chose Huram-Abi, a Baal worshiper from Tyre, to build his temple. The next time around, after the Babylonian exile, he chose Ezra, a God follower, to build his temple. But the version of that was rebuilt, and the version which Jesus walked around in and was so passionate that he attacked people for defiling it, that was overseen by Herod, who killed all the babies and tried to kill Jesus and all these sort of things. So in that example of that particular creative work of God's, we see that he chooses half the time God followers and half the time not God followers, because his project's bigger anyway. So one thing we have to understand is that I think there's often less difference between Christian storytellers and other great storytellers than we think. I think both of us, whether we believe it or agree with it or not, are part of God's large artistic project. But then the other thing is just, there have been a lot of studies recently in the past couple of decades that show that fiction readers are more empathetic. They're better problem solvers. They tend to be more socialized. They tend to feel less lonely. They tend to be more resilient when they face hard situations. There was a really interesting study that showed that fans of horror cinema dealt with the pandemic much better than others. Because you're rehearsing over and over again. You're just dealing with a worst case scenario. You're watching this horrific thing.
And you're not afraid of it.
And you're rehearsing, how do you react to that? How do you feel about that? And it's the same thing with empathy. Over and over again, you're experiencing someone else's story and what it's like to be a different person. And then, of course, all drama is built around conflict. It's about someone solving a problem or a series of problems. And so that makes people better problem solvers. And so at a very basic level, stories, any kind of stories, no matter what the subject is, just the fact that they're stories make us more like God. They uncover the image of God in us. They make us more connected and more empathetic and better problem solvers and more social and less lonely and more resilient. And so I think on a macro scale, the enemy would love for no stories to get told at all.
At all.
Because
love that.
They all pull that out of us.
And great art brings out so much in anybody, regardless of what they believe. That great art is a threat in itself because of the power that it has over people and how it can change you and touch your heart and move you.
Well, and that's a particular issue that Protestant artists have, is that Protestantism is a stream of Christianity that's based very much in the printed word and the spoken word, because the printing press and Protestantism happened at the same time. And so it's about words. And so our mutual friend, Barbara Nicolosi, opened my eyes to this, but she's just talking, she's like, Protestant filmmakers, the mistake they make is they feel like they have to say everything explicitly. And that's not good storytelling. But then the mistake that Catholic filmmakers make, and she can say this, being a former nun herself, is that they don't say enough, because everything is sacramental and everything is the presence of God. And forget that sometimes, yes, you need words for these sort of things. That's an interesting observation, isn't it?
It's a great observation. And you know what it makes me think? It's so typical of man who we let the pendulum swing so far that we have trouble staying in the center. Jesus was the best storyteller. He said, I tell everything in stories. He did allegories. He did analogies. He always was telling stories. And we either try to do that or do that instinctively, but often the pendulum swings and we don't quite get that nuance of how good he was in telling stories.
Yes. And that reminds me, that's actually where I was going when I brought up Protestants and this saying of things in words, is that when I'm talking to artists, I talk to them about all that science and just sort of showing what stories do to people. And so I try to encourage them to just start with telling the best story you can. Don't worry about its meaning, because just by being a story, it's making the world better and it's helping people just by being a story. Then work on layers of meaning and all that sort of stuff. But Christians, particularly Protestants, tend to want to start with a meaning and then like slap a story onto it to carry it into people's minds. And that's just not how things work.
That's a really good point, is to say that's, I think, some of the trouble that people have with some faith-based films is they feel like it's a sermon that's just kind of thrown at you instead of telling a good story, and the message, the theme just comes out because it's a good story.
Yes. And I think there's another dynamic. You mentioned Jesus, the teller of parables, which of course...
I mention him every once in a while.
Yeah, every now and then.
Yeah.
But Jesus as parable teller comes up often in these conversations, particularly from younger emerging Christian artists who see him as their model, right? Mm-hmm. But there's two places where that goes off the rails a little bit. One is that I don't think most people understand that the gospel has anti-narrative properties.
Ooh, tell us.
The gospel's purpose is to unravel our stories and make our story its story. So when the gospel comes in contact with a story, it starts unraveling that story and replacing it with itself. I don't like using the term Christian films. I use the term devotional films. Because I think that's a more accurate description. But the problem with a lot of devotional films, I think, is that they've exposed their story to the gospel to the point where it's gotten unraveled, but they haven't let it finish replacing itself. And so you kind of end up in this, what I call this sort of uncanny valley. And then the other issue that is not unique to Hollywood, but much more prevalent in Hollywood than it is in a lot of other arts. If you write novels or if you're a painter, this is not really something that you encounter. You can think more of yourself as a parable teller when you're writing novels. But when you're working on TV or film, you're in this highly collaborative environment, working with dozens, hundreds of other people, and you're just one voice in there. And you might be the junior writer in a room, and they're telling a story about things that you don't necessarily like or love or agree with or think should be put out into the world, but you are being paid to help them do that as well as possible. And so in Hollywood, our experience is usually not that of Jesus, the parable teller. Mm-hmm. Our experience is usually Daniel, chief of the magicians. So this is something I learned from our mutual friend, Dean Batali, who's a TV writer, producer, showrunner, and he points out that in the Old Testament, magicians, soothsayers, astrologists, mediums, that God's like, kill them. He's like, they shouldn't be allowed to live. Like, I just test them. But then when Daniel is carried away to the court of Babylon, what God does is make him the chief of them. He makes them their boss.
How ironic.
So there's these people that were considered detestable, he put one of his people in charge of. And it talks in Daniel 1 about how he gave Daniel and his friends all understanding of Babylonian literature, which was mostly myths about their gods and astrology. That was the corpus of Babylonian literature at that time. So God is giving Daniel knowledge about astrology and the myths of these other false gods.
All the things he doesn't believe in.
And putting them in charge of all these people because there was a cultural gain to Babylon to be had in that. Mm-hmm. When Jeremiah says, go For in the city's welfare, you'll find your welfare. And so as someone in working in such a highly collaborative medium as film and as TV, you will more often be Daniel in the room full of magicians and astrologers than you're going to be Jesus sitting on the shore and telling a parable. Just, you're going to be participating in a narrative and a conversation, most of which is not native to you and most of which isn't what the conclusions you want people to reach. But you're there to have a voice in that because God has all sorts of reasons.
And we can, just by showing up, we can make a difference. Okay, I have 2 questions I wanted to ask you, and I'll tell you what they are first so you can plan that. One is, as a leader in a church, what would you tell an artist who doesn't want to get involved in church because they don't understand them? And then, as a creative, what would you tell a pastor? You don't want to be involved in this church because they don't get you. How can you help both sides by telling them some piece of advice?
So with artists, I will often start with the felt need of loneliness. Artists often feel very lonely because they're out on the edge of culture trying to come up with things that don't exist yet. And that's hard for most people to know and to understand and to experience. So they often feel very alone. And part of the reason that we are not saved as individuals, we are saved as a people, is for that we are always plugged in and part of something. Jesus makes us a new person with a new family and a new mission. Loneliness is a very easy way into that conversation with artists because most of them have experienced it or are experiencing it or will continue to experience it. And that's part of why it's so important to be part of a church. The other part is that artists, because so much of our world, we work between our ears. So much of our world takes place inside of us. We have a real propensity for being self-centered and placing ourselves at the center of the universe because our personal experience, we're often in the middle of it. And the church is a great antidote to that too. And so I encourage Christian artists not just to be part of church community, but to make sure it's community with people who don't do things like they do. Maybe some other artists, but also stay-at-home parents and businessmen and
teachers
entrepreneurs and teachers and accountants.
Yes.
Because that really helps curb that inward bent when you're realizing how many different ways there are to follow God and have a satisfying life, and sort of pull you out of yourself.
Oh, that's great.
On the church side of things, one thing for churches to think about is how they use their physical space. Artists often need physical space to do what they're doing. Churches often have physical space that no one is using during the week. But I've encountered there's a church in St. Louis, and they had this giant building across the street, and they turned it all into artist studios. And most of those artists were not Christians, but this church in their city wanted to make sure they could do what they did. And that was a real place of connection, and of hospitality.
Yeah.
And there's a church up in Pasadena that has been doing similar things. The church shut down because there weren't enough people. It sort of died and shut down. But the building is being used for artist spaces and for artist exhibitions and galleries. And it's a beautiful way to keep bringing the community into this. So often churches have property that's not being fully used or not used all the time. And that can be a very important way to support the arts. Try to start all of your communication, not with what you're against, but with what you're for.
Yes.
Because the thing is going back to this idea of preservation and progress, most people would say, it's good that you're for us not forgetting who we are and our history and our culture. And it's good that you want us not to stagnate, right? But it's when we frame that as saying what you're doing is wrong because of this. But when you start with what you're for, there's often connection, because even people who are on the progressive scale, they're like, I agree with you. Let's not forget who we are, and vice versa. Another thing for Christians in the arts is to be a faithful presence who doesn't want anything. Christian filmmakers are used to all their interactions being someone who wants something from them. And the church can fall into this trap too, because fame is very seductive and power is very seductive. And also just kind of we're fans of things, and we, but to be a presence who just doesn't want anything except just to be there and to be loving and to be hospitable.
So for a church to open their arms to anybody, regardless of if they're a celebrity, if they're just starting out, just because they care about their heart and their soul, they don't care about their success or their celebrity or their money or their power. Yeah.
Not trying to network, not trying to get something from them. That's really important. The Psalm says that God inhabits the praises of his people. And he gives us this architectural grammar for praise. But the thing is people, as image bearers of God, they don't deserve the same praise, but they do deserve praise when they do something well, when they do something excellent. And this, again, you can create a place for them to dwell, a home, by praising them for the things that you see that they do that are good, whether they're a Christian or not. And a lot of people feel cut loose. They feel like they don't have a home. They feel lonely. And I'm not even just talking about artists now. I'm just talking about 21st century North Americans. And so really think about the way that you can build homes for your people with praise. Finally, take imagination seriously. Something that I think often gets overlooked in the church and even among artists is the fact that the only way that finite beings can have a relationship with an infinite being is imagination. Because a finite being can't understand an infinite being, can't know it. Most of that relationship has to involve some imagining what it's like to be unchanging, imagining what it's like to be perfectly good, because we've never experienced unchangeability. We've never experienced perfect good. So much of what it takes is imagination. And God built us that way because that's the bridge between finiteness and infiniteness. And so the church should take imagination seriously because the upper limit of our imagination is the upper limit of our God. The more we can imagine, the closer we get to just how big and just how expansive that he is. It's still a very small. But when we have small imaginations and they've wasted away and we don't use them, then our picture of God is also very small because that's as far as we can go. And so I would just say to the church, take imagination seriously and take storytelling seriously,
Oh, it's so true. There's a great verse in Psalm that said, I pray that God will illuminate the eyes of your imagination. And that's a great way to end this. I bless you as a leader of the church who supports artists and as a successful published writer to be in the church. Thanks for being a role model.
Thank you.
And I look forward to all that's going to happen with you being the hybrid in between and bringing the two together.
Yes. Thank you so much for giving me a chance just to go on and on about this stuff because, as you can tell, I'm passionate and, there's only so many places you can really get into it.
I love it. Thank you. And thank you for joining us for another Hollywood Changemakers podcast.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Hollywood Changemakers. If you'd like to get connected with us, our Instagram handle is @HollywoodPrayerNetwork. Find out more at HollywoodPrayerNetwork.com.